advertising is particularly good at attaching emotions to brands. Terrific example from years back is a car called the Renault Clio. Years ago they launched with an advertising campaign featuring a couple of French people, Papa and Nicole. The whole idea of that ad was supposed to be that the Renault Clio is a terrifically easy car to drive. However, when you look at that ad, what you're looking at is two people flirting, being terrifically sexy. And of course, what that does is result in you thinking the Renault Clio is a terrifically sexy little car. And lots of people want to be sexy. The result? The most successful car launch ever in the UK. Meta communication are all the twiddly bits, the music, the characters, the setting, the storyline, anything that's not actually to do with what you're telling people. The interesting thing about meta communication is that we are programmed not to be able to unprocess it. Once it's exposed to us, we've got it. There's a company called Huawei who've recently launched an ad featuring a little creature called a GNU being photographed. And the guy who's photographing the GNU looks at his photograph and he imagines what's going to happen to the little GNU. It's going to be captured, it's going to be put in a zoo, it's going to have things thrown at it, da-de-da. He decides not to take the photograph. And the message is, with Huawei, you can be your own judge of morality. What absolute nonsense. I mean, Huawei's a phone, doesn't allow you to do anything, but emotionally very appealing.
In the mid-19th century, there was a very lively, popular press, very widely read by working people, by everyone, reached far beyond the commercial media at the time. It was very diverse. It represented, it reflected public interests and public concerns, and it was very popular. In Britain, they tried to close it down by censorship of various kinds, but that didn't work. There were too many ways to avoid it. And it was finally understood that the way to eliminate it was by advertising. So just through the effect of reliance on advertising, which was then just a kind of beginning, like around a century ago, and concentration of capital, they realized that over time they could marginalize the independent popular press, which couldn't get the advertising, of course, because advertisers don't like what they were saying, and didn't have the capital. And it took a long time. So in England, it was actually up until about 40 years ago, still the case 40 years ago, that the main newspaper in England, the Daily Herald, was a kind of labor-oriented, social democratic newspaper, very popular, outsold all the others. The Mirror, which was the main tabloid, was the same, kind of leftist paper, popular paper, but they kind of succumbed to advertising pressure and capital control. The United States happened a bit earlier, but it was the same process. Advertising is part of a much bigger industry. Advertising is part of the public relations industry, which is a huge industry. And it developed very consciously around the First World War in the two most democratic countries, England and the United States. And there's a good reason for it. As the countries were becoming more free, just through popular struggle, and people were winning the franchise, and you couldn't shut them up anymore by force, it was understood that you're going to have to control people by controlling opinion and attitudes, because we can't rely on force anymore. And control of opinion and attitudes means you want to not only control very closely the lives of people in their work time, but also you have to control them in their off-work time. And what you have to do is turn them into passive, obedient consumers who pay attention to what were called the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption. You get them trapped into consumerism, isolated from one another, atomized, control their beliefs. That's where notions like manufacture of consent come from right after this First World War. And out of this came huge industries. And advertising is a large part of it. And it, of course, affects the media enormously. For example, take, say, television. When you turn on the television set, the corporation doesn't make any money, right? You don't pay them when you turn it on unless it's cable. So why do they do it? Well, they do it because of the advertising. So the resources and the creativity and the effort and so on in the whole television industry goes into advertising. In fact, within the television industry, they there are words called content and fill. Like a program has content and a program has fill. The content is the advertising. The fill is the car chase that's in there to keep you watching until the next ad comes along. And all the effort, of course, goes into the advertising. The fill has two, first of all, it's to keep your interest enough so you watch the advertising, but the advertising is there for a purpose. I mean, it's to turn people into creatures whose only concern in life is to max out their 5 credit cards and not to pay attention to what's going on in the world and let the rich, powerful guys do what they want without interference.
How do you stop your emotions being influenced by advertising? Well, in my book, there's only 2 ways to do it. One is just don't watch any advertising. The other way, curiously enough, is to watch the ad very carefully, is to look at it and to say, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to influence? What's really behind this ad? If I see this little furry animal in the woods, is it there to make me feel good about this brand? Yeah, of course it is. And by doing that, you can do something called counter-arguing. We're not used to counter-arguing the emotion in advertising. But if you look at the ads, if you look at the emotive content in the ads, if you listen to the music, you can say, I know what you're trying to do. So emotionally, you can counter-argue that ad.
Hello everybody and welcome to episode 55 of Life and Life Only, and this is advertising and lifestyle design. I'm almost certain this is going to be a 2-parter, so really I'm introducing episodes 55 and 56. Is it a little bit too late to say Happy New Year? I'm sneaking this out, I think, on the 31st of January or the 1st of February, but I'm reminded of a talk radio phone-in I heard years ago where a caller said that you can say Happy New Year if it's the first time you're seeing someone that year. And the presenter said, well, that wouldn't really work if it was October, would it? Anyway, I hope you had a nice Christmas and New Year. For this episode and the one after it, we're going to take you back nearly 10 years to a talk I did on The Mind Renewed, a website and podcast hosted by Julian Charles that will be well known to regular Life and Life Only listeners. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a second, but the clips you just heard were a guy on the BBC Ideas YouTube channel talking about what advertising does. I think he was talking predominantly about TV advertising, and at the end there, how to resist it, which is something we do mention later on. I guess it'd be in part 2. He didn't mention how to resist BBC propaganda and adverts, but there you go. And then we had our old friend Noam Chomsky talking, I think it was around the 90s, so when he was talking about 40 years ago, he'd be talking about the 50s, talking from the perspective of media about how advertising was used as the world, or I think he was talking mostly about the US and the UK, got more free and how people were moulded into consumers, and indeed people were the product for advertising. We touch on that in the discussion you're about to hear, but I thought I'd let Chomsky explain it there because we don't really talk about that in a great amount of detail. I don't agree with one thing he said, that no effort is put into programs and that all the effort goes into the advertising. I think that's a little bit extreme. I mean, TV ads are an art form. There's no doubt that there's quite a bit of creativity, even if the intent isn't always the best. Chomsky also mentioned Manufacturing Consent, and that was a book that he co-wrote with Edward Bernays. And there was also a documentary, and that is essential for understanding media, which is obviously heavily linked to persuasion and I would argue manipulation. I mean, as we did discuss with the propaganda series we did at the end of last year, you can force people to do things in a totalitarian society, but that will only go so far. And it's actually much better for powerful people to use persuasion and particular tactics to get the populace to comply. In the propaganda series, you may remember a clip of the late John Pilger giving an anecdote, and it was some journalists, I think, from the Soviet Union during the communist era came to the West and said, how do you get, in a nutshell, it was how do you get everyone to have the same opinion about the important things? And Chomsky said elsewhere that what you do is you limit the debate, but then you get people to argue vociferously within the limitations that you've established. If you ever heard of the Overton window, the Overton window is the limit of acceptable debate in mainstream media, basically. I think the Overton window is getting slightly larger, but it's still limited. So, of course, advertising here follows on neatly from that propaganda series, which I hope you enjoyed. I hope some very nice messages and a couple of donations, so thanks for that. Advertising was mentioned in that series a few times, the link really being unseen forces influencing our choices, and that fine line between persuasion and manipulation. And there's a lad called Bernays, if you remember, he gets another mention, or in fact his own section. The techniques can be blatant and subtle, sometimes harmless, sometimes harmful. We do give some dictionary definitions of advertising at the beginning of the talk, but as I did with propaganda, I'll just read a couple of paragraphs from Wikipedia just to flesh it out a little bit. Advertising is the practice and techniques employed to bring attention to a product or service. Advertising aims to present a product or service in terms of utility, advantages, and qualities of interest to consumers. It is typically used to promote a specific good or service, but there are a wide range of uses, the most common being commercial advertisement. Commercial advertisements often seek to generate increased consumption of their products or services through branding, which we do talk about in the conversation, which associates a product name or image with certain qualities in the minds of consumers. On the other hand, ads that intend to elicit an immediate sale are known as direct response advertising. Non-commercial entities that advertise more than consumer products or services include political parties, interest groups, religious organisations, and governmental agencies. Non-profit organisations may use free modes of persuasion, such as a public service announcement. Advertising may also help to reassure employees or shareholders that a company is viable or successful. So that sounds fairly innocuous, but we do get into some quite dark stuff later. As I said, it looks like this will be two parts. A few months ago, a listener gave me some feedback advising me to make the episodes not more than about an hour, and I did take that on board, although with the propaganda episodes, I wanted to get them out before the end of the year, and 3 parts seemed to be okay. They were 3 parts of around 1 hour 20, because I just recorded so much. But in that case, I was working through a book, and if you do episodes of a certain length for the first few chapters of the book, you really have to try and talk a relatively similar amount about each chapter. I have actually bucked that trend of 3 parts. I'm in the middle of a 4-parter for one of my other podcasts, Glass Onion, on John Lennon. Anyway, this talk I did on the Mind Renewed was 4 years before I started Glass Onion, and about 6 years before Life and Life Only, and I was living in Spain and a musician at the time, as you'll hear. Some of you will know that I've tended to switch from a concentrated period of writing to then immersion in music and then podcasting. They're my 3 creative outlets, and I think it works for me just juggling them a little bit. I get bored if I do just one thing for a long time. Also, you'll hear that at this time in 2015, we did this talk, I was doing something akin to podcasting, let's say. I took out a bit where I was talking to Julian about the fact that I was about to go travelling in South America, backpacking at the age of 40. But reference was made to my story Travelling Light, which was in episode 37 of this podcast, and that idea that sometimes your goals are achieved inadvertently. If you haven't heard that story, in a nutshell, I planned to travel light when I went to Southeast Asia, but out of insecurity, I travelled very heavy. My backpack was so heavy, it was damaging my back. But then I lost my backpack. It ended up travelling extremely light, lighter than I'd even intended to originally, and dealing with it okay and actually quite enjoying it. And there was also the idea of travelling light in your mind. And on that subject, Julian Charles did a podcast many years ago called Holding Things Lightly, and if I can find that, I'll put that in the show notes. This is actually relevant as well, because I've been having a bit of January blues after a really lovely December. I always like the pre-Christmas, and I managed to get a bit of time off work, and I really had a nice month. And I was feeling a bit stuck in a rut, and then a couple of days ago, the water went off, and in fact, it had gone off in 3 local towns, and it was due to, I think, a power cut had affected the water treatment centre and it wasn't able to operate. There was actually water available but not coming out the taps, but in a funny way I enjoyed it because there was something at stake, and it sort of woke me out of my that rut I was in. Gave me something to cope with. Of course, I have sympathy for the families and schools who were affected, but luckily it was only about 2.5 days. As I'm talking to you now, the water's come back. And of course, you appreciate it when it comes back. The two things we completely take for granted, I think, are electricity and water. So a negative kind of became a positive there, just like with the losing the backpack. Anyway, back to advertising. I think the big changes in terms of techniques had already happened in terms of subliminal advertising taking over. Obviously, it's evolved in the 10 years since it's taught, but internet advertising was already well established in 2015. So I feel comfortable in saying that stuff we're talking about here is still relevant, and certain techniques such as, using humor or making things exclusive, I mean, they're probably never going to go away, to be honest. There are a couple of topical references. We make reference to Barack Obama, who was the president of the USA at that time, and that was a time when I was much more politically engaged than I am now. But yeah, the fundamentals of advertising and indeed politics don't really change too much. They just get tweaked a bit. In part 2 of the talk, we move on from advertising to talk about a specific article and video related to how what used to be known as the 9 to 5 lifestyle, which is now more like, 8 till 6, how that traps us. And I'll talk about that. I want to comment about that at the end of part 2. If you'd like to help out the show, and it's really helping out the show for my work across my 3 podcasts. The others, if you don't know, Glass Onion on John Lennon, about John Lennon / Beatles, and then Film Gold, about films. There are links in the show notes to Buy Me a Coffee, where you can just make a one-off donation, and PayPal, you can also make a one-off donation, so you don't need to take out any subscriptions. And I did have a few Christmas presents at the end of the year, so thanks again for the people who donated, particularly my new friend Ferenc. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. He's from Hungary. He sent me quite a large donation. I actually did ask him to get in touch. So if you'd like to get in touch, any of you, in fact, but Ferenc as well, lifeandlifeonlypod@gmail.com. One final thing, as with propaganda, awareness is a big thing, and it's worth looking out for traps and trigger words and everything else. Also, if you feel like you've ever been fooled, just remember that the people in advertising and marketing work very closely at these things and are quite skillful in what they do, so don't feel bad. Final thing, try and guess before you listen what the most expensive bottle of water is, because that was one of the things I researched at the time, and see if you're right. I'll now hand you over to Julian Charles, back in 2015. Hello to Julian's past self and my past self. The song at the beginning is not the normal song for the Mind Renewed. It's actually a song called Company Store by Dissident Prophet, who I believe Julian did interview. I don't know if it was the whole band or the lead singer. Again, if I can find that in Julian's TMR archives, I'll put it in the show notes. It's a great song. It takes a key line from 16 Tons by Tennessee Ernie Ford, I owe my soul to the Company Store, and then creates a completely different song, very modern sounding and energetic, and great lyrics as well. I'll cut part 1 off at an appropriate moment so we get 2 parts of about equal length, and I'll see you soon for part 2. For now, enjoy.
It's looking bright. It's like a barcode, it's black and white. I got a credit card, I got a phone. The chips are coming down like a dog with a bone. But I owe my soul to the company store. I owe my soul to the company store. Left, right, 2, 3, 4.
Hello, Julian Charles here of the mindrenewed.com, podcasting to you from the depths of the Lancashire countryside here in the UK. And today I'm very pleased to welcome back to the programme for another one of our quite unstructured but hopefully interesting chats, Antony Rituno, teacher, blogger and freethinker extraordinaire, I will say, originally from the UK but now living and working in Spain, in Madrid. Antony, it's good to speak to you again. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks very much, Julian. Nice to speak to you as well.
Some time since we spoke last time. I actually can't remember quite when it was. About 6 months ago or something, was it? Something like that?
It was just after the new year, yeah. So, yeah.
Well, how have you been doing in the meantime?
Yeah, I've been doing fine, actually. Other than teaching a lot of advanced English, which has taken up quite a bit of my energy, I've been much more immersed in the expat music scene. There's a few Spanish as well, but it's quite predominantly expat. And also, sometimes as I was talking to people, we were joking that it sounded like I was interviewing them, and suddenly a light bulb went off, and I thought, well, done podcasts before, I've been interviewed before, so I decided that I would interview musicians, to promote them and to sort of for myself as well. So I've done 5 or 6 of those, and it's been really good, and all this sort of knowledge that I've accumulated, all these little tidbits of knowledge that whatever my interviewee is talking about, I can manage to chip in with a few things. So,
great. And those are published up on your YouTube account, aren't they?
Yeah, they're all there.
Well, what we agreed that we were going to talk about, of course, was, we haven't agreed a title or anything like that, but it has to do with the subject of sort of advertising and how our lives are structured and formed by forces that are certainly beyond our immediate control. We're thinking of, obviously, government, we're thinking of corporations. So it involves the notions, as I say, of advertising and propaganda. And so it's a very wide field, lots of things to discuss. And I know that we've both been thinking about it. We've got lots of anecdotes and things that hopefully will not just be heavy all the time, but will be slightly light at times, a bit amusing at times. So the best place to start, I guess, is going to be with some kind of definition, I suppose, of some of the words that we're using. So perhaps we should start with advertising. Have you got a definition for that?
Yeah, obviously in dictionaries they vary a little bit, but here's a couple. To advertise, the verb, to try to persuade people to buy a product or service by announcing it on television, radio, newspapers, internet, etc. To provide information about a good or service to influence others. So I guess the key words there would be persuade and influence. Just going back to the title that I thought might be good would be advertising and lifestyle design. As I said, we're going to look at advertising, but in the context of how things are already set up. Our lifestyles are already set up, as you said, in ways we don't know about.
Indeed. And in fact, in preparation for this, looking at some of the resources that you've sent and things that obviously I've found on my own, it becomes increasingly clear that many of the things that we take for granted as being just normality are in fact, have been designed from quite some time ago by various people we have no idea about. And as you think about these things more, you become more aware. We live in this kind of prefabricated reality, really. I'm going too far by saying reality there, but the sort of social structures and societal structures we live in, we take these things for granted, but very often they have been designed for various purposes. And so hopefully we're going to unravel some of those things. So perhaps we should start with the most obvious area of advertising. What hits us when we watch TV or we hear the radio or we look at a newspaper, that sort of thing. That's the most obvious place to start, although, of course, it's only a very small part of what we'll be looking at.
Yeah, sure. Obviously, advertising, TV ads have become far more sophisticated as the years have gone on. And we're going to talk about a certain gentleman, the father of public relations. We'll get onto that later on.
Yeah.
But, if you just want me to take you through a few of the techniques, the sort of very basic stuff. Humour is one. There's a famous advert in England for Cadbury's chocolate bar. The soundtrack of it is the song In the Air Tonight by Phil Collins, which has got a very famous drum break on it. It starts off, it has a close-up of a gorilla that pans out very, 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 very slowly. And you suddenly realise after about 30 seconds or a minute that the gorilla's by a drum kit with drumsticks in his hand and he does the drum break. And what's quite amusing about it is that it's got nothing to do whatsoever with the product. It's purely using humour, making it memorable. And another one, this is using irony in advertising. There's a product called Marmite, which may not mean too much to people overseas, but it's a sort of yeast-based product.
Yeast extract, I think it calls itself, doesn't
yeast
it?
Yeast extract, yeah. And if you have any Australian listeners, they will know Vegemite, which is a sort of vegetarian version of it.
It's pretty good stuff, actually, Vegemite. I have had it.
Yeah, well, they're very clever with this. Basically, it's a young man who takes this gorgeous blonde woman back to his apartment, and they start kissing, and then suddenly he starts retching, and then it just comes up on the screen, Marmite, you either love it or hate it. And it's very clever because it's preying on this thing about it being an acquired taste. And I was thinking as I was watching it, the people that like Marmite are going to feel like some sort of exclusive club. They're going to appreciate that.
Well, actually, I went and had a look at the Marmite website and had some thoughts about this. We're going to pick up this later on when we talk about Edward Bernays with the idea of selling things not just by being upfront about their qualities, but by triggering your desire to buy things in different ways. And, when I looked at this website, it makes a heck of a lot of this, you either love it or you hate it. It's a meme there, out there in the culture. I've heard lots of people say it, away from the context of the TV. And I'm wondering if it's a false dichotomy that's set up there, because some people obviously do dislike it, but say 20% of people really like it, 60% of people think it's okay, and only 20% of people really do dislike it. Okay, well, the meme says you either like it or you hate it. So that might make the 60% who think it's only okay think to themselves, well, I'm not in the dislike camp, so I must be on the like side of it. Oh, well, I like it then, don't I? Even though they're quite sort of neutral about it, but now they think, oh, yeah, I must be one of the like people, and so they end up buying it where they might not have bothered before. Yeah,
I hadn't thought of it like that, but it could be. You maybe have a slight like for something, and then the advertising just pushes you a little bit further.
They obviously think this is working, because when you look at their history, they have a sort of history of favourite adverts, and you look at the old ones, they're all based on health. This is really good for you, the vitamins and all that kind of thing. And you look at their new ones, which they particularly say they like, they're all, well, nearly all of them anyway, are this, you either love it or you hate it. They're playing on that a great deal, so it clearly works.
Yeah, interesting, yeah. You've got other ones, very obvious ones. When you're selling shampoo, it tends to be a woman in a tropical setting with a waterfall in the background and slightly orgasmic look on her face. And then you've got Flake, people in England will know, which is a sort of phallic-shaped chocolate bar, And then general stuff would be just you'll have lots of stuff with friends together consuming a product, with the implication being that if you buy this product, you'll have lots of friends. And then someone pointed out to me, I think it was one of my students, because I bring up advertising quite a lot during my classes. They said, oh yeah, whenever you see car adverts, they're always on the open road. You never see cars advertised with someone stuck in traffic in the middle of the city, obviously.
Well, the only time you would do is if you're trying to sell a car that perhaps fits into small spaces or something like that. But yeah, but by and large, yes, right, they're on the open road, they're in these exotic locations and people having a fantastic time and living the high life, exactly.
That's it. So, some of it's quite blatant and some of it's more subtle. Some of it you might say is fairly harmless, but I think we're going to get on to the more sinister aspect of it later on. But
yeah. Well, talking about the sexual element to all this, I've come across examples of adverts where the actual product that's being sold doesn't just have, a rather attractive model next to it, but now you have the product, obviously because you can Photoshop things so easily, the product is actually in the shape of the model, which is rather interesting. It's got so far that now you are completely objectifying this exaggeration of the female form and identifying that with the product being sold. So you might have a well-known beer with its label and brand logo all morphed into the shape of this female form. So you're not so much selling beer by association with sex. You're almost identifying it with sex.
Yeah, absolutely. I think really it's got more and more blatant. It's got less and less to do with the product. I think, as I said, we'll see that. I've just got some other very short things, but just other techniques if you're interested.
Yeah, because what we're doing here, I think it's fair to say that we're building up a kind of impression of the kinds of things that we're going to talk about, because people are obviously very familiar with these kinds of things, but if we explore these in this kind of impressionistic way, then we'll be making some deeper points about it later on, as I say, particularly in connection with Edward Bernays.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just a few things. You often see things like recommended by doctors, and obviously there'll be a picture of a doctor who's probably an actor. That thing about doctors being trusted, basically. And then limited stocks. What got me thinking about that is this funny paradox of humans. Most people like to be part of a crowd, but we also like to be unique and exclusive as well. So I think the idea of limited stocks, a bit like the Marmite, it buys into the idea that you can be in some sort of exclusive club.
Oh, you mean like the limited edition of a bottle of wine or something like that?
Yeah, limited stocks or that kind of thing.
Yeah, the strange thing about that is I remember that way back, my parents used to like Vauxhalls. I'm not sure I was ever very keen on them, but they used to constantly have Vauxhalls. And I remember them buying one on one occasion, and I think it said a limited edition or something like that. And what was it? I don't know what it was, a Vauxhall Victor or something way back. But it was this limited edition. But all it was just, I think you could have a different colour from usual. And of course it had a little printed limited edition at the back. Well, so what? But I suppose it made some people feel they were, perhaps even my parents feel, that they were buying into something special, but clearly it wasn't special.
Yeah. Other ones, quite interesting. A lot of this is about language. When you see something advertised as part of a nutritious breakfast, which part? I mean, you could sprinkle sawdust on a nutritious breakfast and the sawdust would be part of a nutritious breakfast. So.
Yes, it's when they sell these things and say, this is useful for reducing cholesterol or something as part of a calorie-controlled diet. And exactly. Yes, depends entirely upon what else you do with your diet, exactly.
Yeah.
In fact, I wanted to mention something about this 5-a-day business, which is absolutely massive, isn't it? And advertisers jumping on this straight away, so they say, well, our product is one of your 5 a day. For people not in the UK or from the UK, this is the idea that you're supposed to have 5 portions of fruit or vegetables each day. So any product that gives you one of your portions, you see, is a good product. Whether it's also full of fat and sugar is another matter. We have a friend who is a patent lawyer, and she knows somebody who was on this committee that was deciding this 5-a-day business. So this person was sat on this decision. They were basically pulling numbers out of thin air. They were basically thinking like, well, 4 doesn't sound quite enough. 7 or 8 sounds too many, and it's got to be an odd number because everything, like in flower arranging, you have an odd number of flowers. It just feels right. So they chose the number 5. So there's apparently no scientific basis to that whatsoever. It's just, it sounds good. And, it's generally good advice to eat fruit and vegetables. But, people go on and on about 5 a day. And, of course, it's fantastic for these advertisers to jump on that bandwagon.
Well, funnily enough, I had some notes about that as well. Because I said I live in Spain. I have actually lived in England permanently for over a decade. And when I go back, it's very interesting to see things that you can notice. And I noticed this a few years ago. And first of all, I'm thinking, why do we need anyone to tell us how much fruit and vegetables to eat? I mean, why can't we make that call ourselves?
But the thing is, it doesn't even tell you, does it? It just says portions. Or what's a portion anyway?
Exactly.
Or do you have just one slice of an apple? Is that a portion?
Yeah, and I mean, I start to get really annoyed at people I know and stuff going on about it. And it's one of those perfect examples of something that's just been given to you. It's completely and utterly unnecessary. The other thing was that this is absolutely no word of a lie. I took my nephew swimming a few years ago, one of the times I was back, and they had 5 a day plastered on a vending machine, presumably because they were selling fruit juice or something. And I mean, do a bit of research into fruit juice, you'll find it's not got much to do with fruit. So, should I just carry on with a few more techniques? I mean,
sure.
You probably know why they have peanuts and crisps next to the bar as bar snacks.
Oh, next to the bar? You mean in a pub?
Yeah.
Well, presumably so that when you're going to buy your beer, you see the peanuts and crisps and think, oh yeah, I feel hungry now.
Yeah, well, they give you a dry mouth. That's what it is. Peanuts give you a dry mouth, so you...
There you go. I hadn't thought that one through. But yes, that makes complete sense, of course, because it's the salt content, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. That's it, yeah. There's other stuff. I mean, I notice this a lot in Italy. In supermarkets, they move items around randomly, which of course means you have to walk around for longer to find the item that used to be in one place. One which I think you'll find quite amusing. The idea of when you have, for example, something is £2 each and then 3 for £5, so you make a small discount by buying more. Now, obviously, in a lot of cases, you're going to end up buying 3 where you only really need 1, so you're not necessarily saving money.
And then it goes bad because you bought too much and you can't actually use it.
Yeah, that's it, depending on the product. I read about this fellow, it was in somewhere really obscure like Holland or Belgium or one of those countries. He had a shop and he obviously had a sense of humour as well, and he did a little experiment where he had something like €2 each, 3 for €6, which obviously doesn't save you any money. And then he even did something like, let's say, for example, €3 each, 3 for €10, so you actually end up paying more. And he reported that people actually went for it, because they obviously didn't stop and think. Perfect example of this idea of just trigger words, trigger ideas being enough without anyone actually literally doing the maths in this case.
Well, indeed, I can believe that. I don't know whether it's done deliberately, but we have noticed a couple of times in various supermarkets where that phenomenon has happened, where you actually buy in bulk and you end up paying more for it. And we've often thought, well, that must just be a mistake. But perhaps it's not. Perhaps that is actually an attempt to fool people. I don't know. I don't want to pronounce upon that. But we have noticed that occasionally happening.
Wow, I'm amazed that's actually in a commercial supermarket.
Yes, it has happened a few times.
Wow, you actually paid more or you paid the same?
Well, we didn't actually do it.
No.
We did the basic maths there on the spot and thought, actually, it's not in our interest to do that. Let's just buy them separately because it's cheaper.
Wow,
yeah.
Unbelievable. Okay. Yeah, there was a book I came across. I haven't read it, but I've read bits of it that are on the internet by a gentleman called Paco Underhill, which is a great name. It's called Why We Buy, The Science of Shopping. So I'll add it to my list of about 150 books that I've got to read.
Well, let's be a bit sort of grumpy old men about this kind of thing for a while, shall we? Why not? Having a daughter now who's 11 years old, it's really annoying going to a supermarket and find that, all the sweets are just at the right height level, exactly parallel with her eye. You're there for ages, of course, waiting for this queue to go, and then she's going, oh, can I have this? Can I have that? Parents all over the world experience this, but it has to be said, it is extremely annoying.
Yeah.
Another thing that annoys me in supermarkets is the deceptive packaging. You're trying to look for something, say, free-range chicken or something, or even an organic product, and you tend to associate that with green colour because that's what producers tend to use. And so then there are these copycat producers. They produce something which isn't organic and it's not free range or whatever, and yet they try to kid you into that. So you find yourself sort of picking it up and almost about to put it in your basket, and then you think, just a minute. And some of these products are very close to each other physically as well, so particularly annoying and deceptive.
Yeah.
And while we're on this sort of complaining about these things, we do use a loyalty card, but we're trying to wean ourselves off using the supermarket as much as possible. And it's actually an improvement what they've had, this particular supermarket before, where they had a sort of voucher system. You would have to collect these vouchers. Voucher number 1 in the first week, voucher number 2 in the second, voucher number 3 in the third week, and then you'd spend that in the following week. And it was all these little narrow windows of activity, and if you got any of them wrong, you'd lose your... So it meant you had to go back those particular weeks. And I felt sort of controlled by it, so I didn't really like it, and I wasn't very keen on collecting these things.
It sounds like it's adding extra stress as well. You have to try and remember the days for a fairly small saving.
Still, I thought I'd mention it because it annoyed me. I felt slightly controlled by it, or at least there was an attempt to control me by it.
Yeah, sure. I've got some other stuff on shopping malls, which is quite classic stuff. Because a shopping mall, all these sort of tricks are all concentrated in one area. So you really, when you walk into a shopping mall or shopping centre, as you say in England, you're really walking into one massive trap. Massive series of traps. I'll just give you a few... most people, because the majority of people are right-handed and sort of right-oriented, they put a lot of tempting offers on your right, because most people turn right when they turn into shopping centres or department stores. But interestingly, a lot of them don't put the really good stuff right in front of you, because apparently people need time to acclimatise when they walk into a department store. You need 10 seconds to get used to your new surroundings. It was very interesting that they'd gone into that much detail.
Absolutely.
And you got some stuff that people would be familiar about, which is to do with coffee smells and bun smells. They always make those more prominent, and they often cook buns or heat cinnamon buns right near the entrance, so you get this lovely smell. They also apparently burn sugar and cinnamon to make the smell linger, which I thought was interesting.
Well, I have wondered about Subway, because we have one locally, and when you go past it, the smell is so strong. I do think to myself, they must be deliberately piping that out, because no other establishment is like that.
Yeah, and then you've got other stuff in department stores, the restaurants usually on the top floor, because people... Obviously, if they enter on the ground floor, they're likely to go up, and they tend to keep going up and up unless there's anything particularly interesting on the basement. And so, of course, they'll get to a point where they'll get hungry and thirsty, or, well, in my opinion, they'll think they're hungry and thirsty. That's another story. And then they get to the restaurant on the top floor to get all that lovely food to sate their hunger. Clearance items are usually at the back, because when you spot a bargain, it probably puts you in a good mood, and you have to walk through lots of more expensive items to get to the clearance items. Well,
the thing about placing things, I've noticed for years how you go straight into the supermarket and what you find the first thing is a load of vegetables and fruit on offer. And I've wondered whether that's just to give the impression of just how health conscious we are, what a lovely place this is. But of course, what's so annoying about it is that you then buy those things first of all, delicate things, and then you go through the rest of your shopping and you end up squashing your vegetables, or you have to spend ages rearranging those things. But that annoyance mustn't be so great that it puts people off going. It must be in the interests of the supermarkets to give this sort of healthful impression when you go through the door.
Well, there's one theory that I read. They do that because the people will pick up fruit, and people, being the strange animals they are, they'll feel proud of themselves that they're eating something healthy, so they'll allow themselves guilty pleasure. They'll allow themselves a guilty pleasure.
That's very plausible indeed.
That's very plausible, yeah. There's some other stuff in supermarket aisles. The staple items, just essential items, are often in the middle of the aisle, so whichever way you enter from, you're going to have to go past luxury items to get to the staple stuff. And I mean, I haven't checked that, physically myself, but it seems to make sense. And then I really wanted to tell you about mineral water. I was curious to find what the most expensive bottled water Are you ready for this? The most
Go on, then.
expensive water where you're actually just paying purely for the water, there's one called Veen Velvet, which is $23 a bottle. $23, Julian, for water.
What size of bottle do you know?
It looks sort of fairly standard. I don't know, maybe a litre. I can't remember. There's more and more expensive. And obviously, if you go to a hotel...
What, more expensive than that?
Yeah, but they're actually... You're paying more for the bottle than the water. And you've got crystal-decked, Hello Kitty branded Fillico, Fillico. It's a water bottle that you're actually paying for rather than water. And then this is absolutely hilarious. I hope this isn't made up. You can get concentrated water, which comes from off the coast of Hawaii. And it's designed to be diluted with real water. And it goes for $16.75 an ounce. So,
Oh, that's got to be a prank, though, surely.
I don't know. I checked it wasn't The Onion, and it wasn't theonion.com. So.
Yeah, but it could still be a commercial prank. So the idea that that you'd buy that for somebody's birthday or something as a joke. We've got this joke in our family where you can buy powdered water and you just add water to rehydrate it.
Oh, yeah.
And there were years ago, I understand that somebody was selling Californian Air in cans.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Those sorts of things do exist, and presumably people buy them to give to their mates as a joke.
I've got quite a good example of people being led, if you're interested, because it actually refers to Tony Gosling, who was on your show.
Yes.
So, I mean, this is just a very good example of planting an idea in people's minds. He gave an anecdote on another interview he did. He used to do phone-ins on Radio Solent, which is in Portsmouth in the south of England.
And I was working down there. It was when it was the very first day of the first Gulf War in 1991, the invasion of Kuwait. And Portsmouth's very close to us. It's a military town. We decided we were going to do a discussion in the morning on the phone-in all about the war. And the producer I worked with was a fantastic woman. She had typed out a script for the presenter, who was the girl that presented The South Today, which was the BBC's TV thing in the evening. She was on our radio station in the morning doing a phone discussion, so everyone kind of knew who she was. And she read out this thing saying, oh, people phone in, could people just phone in? If you tell us what you think about this war, is it the right thing to do, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, as she read this, what we always did was we would play a bit of music. She'd read out a script, introducing the topic for people to phone in about, a little bit of music, and at that point the music went on, you see the lights all starting to light up as people started to phone in, and we filtered through the calls. But that morning, nothing happened. I was sitting there, and I turned to the producer, I said, what the hell's going on? Are they someone jamming our phone lines or what? And she looked at me and she said, well, actually, no, we just haven't told them what to think yet.
So basically what they did was they just rejigged the script, so to speak, giving people triggers for their opinions, like, do you think that Saddam Hussein is a dangerous man? They were still asking the same question, but giving people triggers, giving people something to respond to.
Which was saying things like, have you got someone who's in the forces now? Are you worried about them? Have you ever been to that part of the world? Tell us if you've ever been to the Middle East, what do you think? And as the presenter was reading the script out, I was just gobsmacked as the phone line started lighting up. Bop, 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 bop. And we had a big audience there, a whole of Southampton and Portsmouth and all surrounding areas we were covering. So you can see that there is this kind of, especially with things that are far away, if it's in your own backyard, we know what to think about it. But so much of what we see in here today, particularly in the mass media, is something we never have any direct experience of. We're really trusting the press. And this is why it's so important that our press tells the truth about what's going on in other parts of the world.
That's just a perfect example. It's not so much the content, it's just if you give people something to work with rather than making them or forcing them to come up with something original, then they respond to it. And again, I'm not saying people are stupid. We discussed this when we did the Changing the Discourse. In my opinion, they've been conditioned to respond rather than to produce.
Yes, that's a good point. And of course, I think we also have to recognise that, even those of us who are keyed in to this kind of thing, we're still being manipulated in various ways that we're completely unaware of. And I think the more you look into this, the more that becomes clear. So I don't think, we're saying, oh, well, we're great, we're aware of everything that's going on. I'm sitting here saying, absolutely not. I'm quite convinced there are ways in which I'm being manipulated, and I haven't got a clue where that is. And I'm sure that, the more I look into it, the more I will find, and probably will never come to the end of it. So it's a kind of situation that we're all sitting in. We're all equal on this one, in a sense.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I'm not complacent about it at all, but certainly awareness limits the influence. There's no doubt about that. I think a lot of people ask, does advertising work? because they don't really believe that they would see sort of a picture of a Big Mac on a wall and then immediately go straight to McDonald's. But I thought I might just give you a few numbers, which are quite scary, really, about how much money is spent on advertising and how much influence it can have. And this was actually from 2011. Apparently £16.1 billion was spent on ads in the UK. And, of course, one of the things that I got from reading one of Chomsky's books was how much newspapers and TV as well rely on advertising. And I always assume that newspapers got a lot of money from people buying the newspaper. But I think the advertising revenue is far more significant than the actual price of the newspaper. And just to give you a good example, there was an MP called Michael Meacher who was in Blair's government and resigned over Iraq. He gave a quote to The Guardian saying that the war on terrorism is bogus, which, you know, to the alternative movement is not a very controversial idea, but I suppose in the mainstream it is. And apparently that lost The Guardian £1 million in advertising subsidies almost instantly. And a lot of the advertisers threatened a total boycott if The Guardian ever printed anything like that again. If that can happen to The Guardian, then you try and imagine what would happen if, say, a regional paper printed something like that. You know, it could finish them. And that's why, you know, we never really see any references to 9/11 or in England 7/7. It's just off the table because they're just too scared of losing advertising revenues.
Absolutely, yes. You mentioned Chomsky, and of course this very much fits with his observation that people often think of advertising the wrong way round. The advertising model that certainly was in my mind before I read Chomsky on this was the idea that, you know, the advertiser buys airtime, say, from the TV company, and then the TV company makes its programs. But Chomsky pointed out that the TV company is actually selling an audience to the advertiser. And so the audience kind of is the commodity being offered for sale to the business that wants to sell the stuff. You know, that allows us to see that the TV company will therefore mould its programming. The newspaper will mould what it prints so as to maximise and tailor the audience according to the needs of the advertiser.
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, when you're watching TV programmes, particularly in countries where there's lots of ads, the ads, without realising, will be tailored, or they certainly won't have sort of negative messages. I mean, one example, someone said that if there's lots of car ads, they won't be in a show where someone's having problems with their car, you know. So they don't want to give any idea that any of the cars that are being advertised could ever possibly break down. You know, it's one of those.
And in some ways, you know, it's objectionable. But I think what's objectionable about it is the way they play on our general ignorance about this. So, I mean, you know, if I wanted to consciously buy into this situation, so I wanted to watch a programme, that would be okay. I'm saying I'm going to sell my attention, I'm going to sell my time to the TV company because I want to watch the programme they've produced. And so if I'm making that transaction consciously, that's absolutely fine. But what I don't like, of course, is the idea that people just get into this sort of passive alpha wave brain state or whatever and just sitting there and don't realise that actually there's an exchange going on there with their time and their attention that they're not even aware of. So that seems to me to be exploitation. You know, if only everybody could be aware that they're actually making that transaction, then it wouldn't be nearly as objectionable as it is in fact.
Yeah, well, this is one of the dangers of in a lot of houses. The TV is just on permanently, and it's not even that you're watching it. In a way, that's more dangerous, because if you're concentrating on a program that you really want to watch, at least your attention is centered on something. But it's when the TV's on and you're doing something else, and the TV's on almost just like a friend. You know? This is where it's dangerous, because your attention is scattered, and you do get into this state. You know, and if you haven't got anything that you're actually focusing on, then I think you're even more malleable. So, you know, it's a form of hypnosis, really.
There is a Christian philosopher actually called Douglas Gruthus, and he expresses concern about the way TV manipulates people in the sense of getting people to stop thinking. Programs are often produced with very short scenes and quickly flashing images and changing colours and different angles and these sorts of things. And I've noticed it particularly with children's TV, which is quite disturbing. And his opinion about this is it actually works against critical thinking, because your mind is so overloaded with all these images and sounds that you can't process them properly. And that makes you more susceptible to whatever message wants to come through on the TV there. And I think he's got a good point, actually. And he looks at it as a kind of crude version of postmodernism, in the sense, you know, postmodernism being that idea, you know, all meta-narratives, the big narratives about everything are now suspect. And of course there is some truth in postmodernism. I don't want to be completely negative about it. I think it's actually a useful tool in some ways for us to be critical of the things that we believe. But nevertheless, when it's taken in that really crude way to break everything up so that there's no narrative at all, so you can't even understand what's going on, then you are susceptible to any message that the TV producers want to throw at you. I think he's got a good point there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it shortens your attention span, and then you get more impatient by things which do take more attention. You know, I mean, I have seen comparisons about how many cuts are made in the average Hollywood film in the 1940s compared to now. And I mean, you can probably imagine, you know, watch a film in the 1940s and you might find it quite refreshing, even if the acting's terrible. The camera's on something for much longer and it just follows people around. Whereas now, I mean, can you imagine how many cuts are in the average Hollywood action film? It must be in the thousands, I'd imagine.
And, you know, that could be dismissed as just a matter of fashion. But I think, based upon the kinds of things that we're going to lead towards when we look at the sort of darker side of this, I think it's probably reasonable for us to think that it's not all just fashion. There is some design behind at least some of this.
Yeah.
Well, we have mentioned Edward Bernays, and I'm just wondering whether we should talk about him a little, because obviously he is a very little-known person, but a very important figure in this, isn't he?
Yeah, I mean, he's nicknamed the father of public relations, but I actually tagged him the most influential man you've never heard of, because he did actually manage to get in Time magazine's 100 most influential men of the 20th century, but I'm sure if you asked the man on the street who Edward Bernays is, I'm sure most people wouldn't have a clue.
And he's famous for being the nephew of Sigmund Freud?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, he's actually the double nephew of Sigmund Freud. He was especially proud of that, apparently. He's known as the father of public relations, and public relations is basically propaganda, given a nice sounding name, because propaganda didn't actually used to have a negative connotation, but I think it was during the war, one of the wars, that it started to develop that. So public relations is basically an invented term.
Particularly, I think it must have been the Second World War, though, where that became particularly objectionable.
Yeah, because when he wrote his book Propaganda, which was 1928, I think the word was still a sort of neutral word.
Absolutely.
I guess the most famous quote, which I think comes right at the beginning of the book, which is conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organised habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are moulded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we've never heard of. And I mean, that's in 1928. He's talking about an invisible government, and he's talking about people behind the scenes influencing us. So, you know, no conspiracies here, you know, sleep tight.
Yeah, that's how he starts the book, isn't it, actually?
Yeah, it's the first paragraph, even the first words, but it's definitely right at the beginning.
Yeah, and I think it's very instructive, actually, to take a look at Bernays' book, Propaganda, which Noam Chomsky refers to as the real manual when it comes to these things. And so, you know, if we turn to the real manual here, you've already quoted from Chapter 1 with that opening statement. And then it's interesting in Chapter 5 that he justifies this manipulation of the population by saying it's necessary because of mass production. He says, quote, mass production is only profitable if its rhythm can be maintained, that is, if it can continue to sell its product in steady or increasing quantity. The result is that while under the handicraft or small unit system of production that was typical a century ago, demand created the supply, today supply must actively seek to create its corresponding demand. A single factory, potentially capable of supplying a whole continent with its particular products, cannot afford to wait until the public asks for its product. It must maintain constant touch through advertising and propaganda with the vast public in order to assure itself the continuous demand which alone will make its costly plant profitable. This entails a vastly more complex system of distribution than formerly. To make customers is the new problem. One must understand not only his own business, the manufacture of a particular product, but also the structure, the personality, the prejudices of a potentially universal public, unquote. So it's not that you're necessarily creating something that people need or that people even want to start with. What you're doing is, first and foremost, creating a demand for whatever it is that you want to sell. So whether people actually want it or not is irrelevant. You actually have to make people want whatever it is that you want to sell. And so this is a justification for manipulating people so that business can function in this mass-produced kind of way. And you do that, he says, by coming to understand what it is that motivates people on a deep level, which takes me to Chapter 4, where he discusses the psychology of public relations. And this is a a fascinating quote. Men are rarely aware of the real reasons which motivate their actions. It is chiefly the psychologists of the school of Freud who have pointed out that many of man's thoughts and actions are compensatory substitutes for desires which he has been obliged to suppress. A thing may be desired not for its intrinsic worth or usefulness, but because he has unconsciously come to see in it a symbol of something else, the desire for which he's ashamed to admit to himself. A man buying a car may think he wants it for purposes of locomotion, whereas the fact may be that he would really prefer not to be burdened with it and would rather walk for the sake of his health. He may really want it because it is a symbol of social position, an evidence of his success in business, or a means of pleasing his wife." Unquote. So if you can come to understand what it is that deeply motivates people, then you tap into that. That will then allow you to sell people things which are not necessarily what they really want. They want them for other reasons. They don't want it because it's a car. They want it because it says something about themselves or something along those lines. So it's really deviously tapping into people's deep psychology.
Every idea that wants to establish itself, whether it's to sell more paper cups that we work with, or to make people more honest or more virtuous, depends on public consent. And so we worked out the engineering of consent, which applies to any social goal. But people who don't have social goals, unfortunately, can also employ it. But we depend upon a democratic public that theoretically and practically wants to be led to where it wants to go, which hopefully is a sound life in every part of the life. This can be applied to anything from a university to a government department, to a hospital, to a bookstore, or to a furniture manufacturer.